welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and today I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you about Roger Touhy, the Irish Prohibition gangster who went head-to-head with Al Capone and lived to tell the tale. At least for a little while. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to that Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Roger Touhy was born on September 18, 1898. Some sources say 96, but most agree that 1898 is the correct date, on 822 South Robie Street in Chicago, Illinois, to James A. Touhy, an Irish immigrant and policeman, and his wife Mary. Touhy was the second youngest of the family. He had two sisters, one his junior, and 5 older brothers, James Jr., John, Joe, Tommy, and Eddie. The area was known to be, according to the Daily Herald in 1972, filled with working-class people consisting of big families and low incomes. Mary was noted to have been a devout Catholic who insisted on her children's mass attendance, while their father, James, who was noted to have been an honest policeman, was a firm disciplinarian who beat his children. And perhaps this balance might have worked if their mother had survived their upbringing. Mary died in a house fire caused by the explosion of their kitchen stove in 1908, when Touhy was only 10 years old. Up until that point, he had attended public school. After Mary's death, perhaps as a way to honor her devotion to her faith, or perhaps for the sake of additional assistance in raising 8 children, or perhaps a bit of both, the Touhy children would then be enrolled in Catholic school at St. Joseph's. Unlike most mobsters, and certainly unlike most of our Prohibition-era crew, Roger Touhy was an excellent student. It's even widely reported that he was valedictorian of his 6th grade class. More on his evident intellect in just a moment. Academics alone, it would seem, were not sufficient to keep Touhy out of trouble. James's attempt to keep his children on the straight and narrow by beating them and sending them to Catholic school was not a winning combination. 5 out of his 6 sons would turn to a life of crime. Eddie Touhy was the only one of the brothers who would not go on to have a checkered criminal history. Roger Touhy did not immediately turn to a life of crime just out of grade school like many others we have seen. In fact, Touhy, unlike many others we've studied on this channel, gave up what looked like a promising career in order to pursue crime. He would obtain one of the cornerstones of the American dream when his hobby horse of working with amateur radio in his youth, also known as ham radio, would be the foot in the door he needed to start official work as a telegrapher with Western Union. I want you to remember that amateur radio used to be called ham radio because I have a joke later that I really want to land. Anyway, due to his proficiency at Western Union, he would soon be promoted to manager of his office. Unfortunately for Touhy, his early support of unionization of telegraphers at the age of 17 in 1915 would be the start of his professional downfall. Because of this expressed support of unionizing, he was fired from Western Union. But never doubt a budding mobster's ability to fail upward. Also, I just have to note that becoming a manager of a Western Union office at the age of 17 is a pretty impressive feat. Instead of sitting on his hands and feeling sorry for himself, Touhy brushed himself off and found work as a union organizer for the Commercial Telegraphers Union of America. It's likely because of his role as union organizer that the siren song of organized crime began calling his name. After feeling this role lacked security with CTUA, Touhy moved on to working at the Order of Railroad Telegraphers. He would then move to Colorado for his work. It's from here that Touhy would become a Harvard man. Sort of. He enlisted in the Navy in 1918 to help the U.S. war effort, but did not see combat. Instead, he was sent to Harvard University to teach naval officers Morse code in one of the classrooms that Harvard lent out to the military for assistance during the war. Despite this unofficial connection to Harvard University, Touhy would spend the rest of his life bragging that he had been at Harvard. And I mean, be honest, wouldn't you? I would. It would seem that having Harvard on his resume would open doors for him. After he and a Navy buddy got out of the service, he and Touhy moved to Oklahoma, not Arizona, what does it matter, to get involved in crime. I really hope the Racket Reviews audience appreciates a Three Dog Night reference, otherwise that joke did not land. Back to Touhy, this move corresponded with Prohibition, and while in Oklahoma, Touhy would bribe a petroleum engineer with corn whiskey to teach him his trade until Touhy knew enough to lie through an interview to get a good-paying job as a petroleum engineer himself. Of course, getting the job and knowing how to do the job are two different things, but fear not, Touhy, although he had no idea how to be a petroleum engineer, had a plan in place. Touhy would bribe the other workers on the jobs to do his work for him by, once again, trading their skills for corn whiskey. After he saved up enough money, Touhy began investing in oil leases until he made enough in a year, about $400,000 in today's money, to comfortably move to Chicago. Upon his return to Chicago, he would reconnect with the girl he'd met 7 years ago at Western Union, Clara Morgan. Quickly thereafter, the couple would be wed on April 22nd, 1922. After the couple was married, he would work 2 jobs, one as a car salesman and one as a taxi driver. If there was one thing Touhy knew how to do, it was make money. From the car salesman's salary and commission alone, Touhy would be able to buy a home with an income of $50,000 per year, a solid income even by today's standards, but in 1922 this was an equivalent of $800,000 annually. The couple would go on to have 2 sons, Roger Scott Jr. in 1925 and Thomas in 1927. Around the time of Roger Jr.'s birth, the family would move from the hubbub of Chicago to the rural suburb of Des Plaines, Illinois. With the money Touhy had earned, he would go into seemingly legitimate work with his brothers, Eddie and Tommy, by starting a trucking company. According to Touhy himself, though, this trucking enterprise was created with the intent to bootleg in mind. It was an obvious move since Touhy's car dealership was very close to a saloon owned by bootlegger Matt Kolb, who happened to purchase a car from him. I'm reading between the lines a little bit here, but I'm under the impression that Touhy and Kolb had been in talks together prior to Touhy starting his trucking company. The 2 men would go on to become such a juggernaut in the bootlegging business that they directly rivaled the Chicago outfit. And we're talking about the Chicago outfit under the leadership of Al Capone. And if you're watching this and you've never heard of him, you have certainly stumbled onto the right channel to find out more. But you must have been living under a rock up until now. The rest of you know the kind of dangers that come along with going toe-to-toe with Al Capone. Yes, Touhy and Kolb were teeing up to play a very dangerous game in the Chicago underworld, and they played it boldly. Kolb had previously been part of the outfit, and this insider knowledge would prove invaluable to the duo's attempted coup. It's even reported that at one time, Kolb had provided Capone with up to 1/3 of the outfit's beer supply, but he'd pulled out of his involvement when it got too violent. It would seem, however, that Kolb was ready to get back in the game, and Touhy provided him with that on-ramp, with Touhy investing $10,000 into expanding his business to include several breweries in Chicago under Kolb's guidance. The 2 men became partners in crime. The Touhy-Kolb bootlegging operation is, in my opinion, one of, if not the most sophisticated operations in the history of Prohibition. But you would expect nothing less from a Harvard man, right? Here are some of the ways that Touhy and Kolb made sure that their beer product was safe, branded, and delicious. Kolb's beer and liquor would be transported by way of Touhy's trucks, many of which had been painted like Texaco trucks to avoid suspicion, and hire off-duty police officers to drive the trucks, just in case any of them got pulled over anyway. They hired chemists to make sure that their beer was not only plentiful, but also the best tasting around. It was all very Breaking Bad, the Prohibition years. Touhy and Kolb made sure to hide the most obvious evidence. Much of the brewing took place on Touhy's property, which again was located on rural farmland. One of the major issues with brewing beer or whiskey during a time in which it was illegal to do so was that it stank. The unique smell that comes from used mash tipped off several law enforcement officers in the past and led to the arrests of many. Mash is the term used to describe the ingredients from which the fermentable and non-fermentable sugars and flavors are combined with yeast, then brewed. So Touhy would need to dispose of this mash in the creek nearby his home. Simple enough, right? But there was one major problem. Touhy's neighbors stood in the way of him and the creek. And here's where Touhy's innovative thinking kicks in. Touhy invited his neighbors to join him on a 3-week European vacation at his expense. An offer they could not refuse, I'm sure. While they were away, Touhy had his men build a secret sewer system that odorlessly transported the mash to the creek. They were supplying to nightclubs all over Chicago and making money hand over fist. Not only did they have beer that bar owners could reasonably anticipate they would receive without issue, it was also tasty. With this extra money, Touhy and Kolb got into the gambling rackets in 1926. Yet another Capone toe they were stepping on. They placed their slot machines in gas stations and drugstores all over the town in strategic fashion. This enterprise alone made them millions. Naturally, this money meant that they could buy off law enforcement officers and politicians, much to the aggravation, once more, of the Chicago outfit. One major difference between the Touhy crew and the outfit, however, was that Touhy did not get involved in prostitution. In fact, he made sure that law enforcement understood that he would never allow it in his territories. Other things Touhy did to curry favor included keeping some of the more unsavory, violent mobster types away from his territories, and buying ice cream for the local children every Sunday. Touhy and Kolb were clearly beer kings of Chicago at this point, even selling to Capone and company. Of course, the outfit wasn't thrilled about buying out from beneath their umbrella of influence, and this is where trouble began brewing. Get it? Between the outfit and Touhy's crew. Capone would put Touhy to the test on several occasions before their rivalry grew to epic proportions. It should be noted before I even get started, however, that the frequency and intensity with which the outfit tested Touhy is very much up for debate. Just about every source has a different way of telling the story, and breaking down the intricacies of each theory would take a long time and it would be quite boring. I'm going to run through the abridged version of most of the widely publicized events, and if you've heard a different version of the story before, don't be surprised. Alright, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's explore the ways in which Al Capone tried to muscle Touhy into submission. I also need to explain that in comparison to the outfit, Touhy's crew was extremely small. They were not the behemoth of organized crime the way that Capone's machine was, and in fact, they had very much put all their eggs into the basket of bootlegging and became masters of their craft. If Touhy's crew were to go toe-to-toe with the outfit, they would be eliminated immediately. So you really have two options when the cards are stacked against you: fold or bluff. Touhy chose the latter. Capone realized that Touhy's territory had a noticeably absent brothel scene, and with them being such a major moneymaker for the outfit, Capone sent some of his men to try and muscle Touhy out of his territory in order to establish the gambling and prostitution scene there in addition to his bootlegging empire. Touhy, determined to keep all that he had built, but conscious of the fact that he had no chance against the outfit, decided to put on a show for Capone and his outfit members. During the meeting with the Capone men, Touhy hired farmers and off-duty police officers to pose as his men in order to give the outfit the impression that Touhy had a much larger sphere of influence than was the reality. During this meeting, Touhy would receive several fake phone calls and pretend to give the order to a few of his men to execute people in hushed tones after they had cinematically interrupted the meeting to speak with Touhy allegedly about these pressing matters. After giving the outfit men a show, Touhy declined Capone's bid to take over. It might sound a little corny, but it did the trick. Capone's men returned to him with their rejected offer, convinced that Touhy was over an enormous operation. Capone must have suspected that something wasn't quite right, as he would then send some of his A-listers, Jack Machine Gun McGurn and Louis Little New York Campagna. Both are men whom we have spotlighted on this channel, to give an accurate sizing up of Touhy and once again push to take over the portion of Touhy's operation. Cue an encore from Touhy. Touhy put on the same show for McGurn and Campagna that he had for the last set of outfit men, and once again, I'm sure to Touhy's relief, the performance was convincing. McGurn and Campagna returned to Capone, convinced of Touhy's legitimacy. It was apparently by convincing the outfit of his level of influence that Touhy would receive the criminal nickname of Touhy the Terrible. Okay, negotiations had taken place, but now Touhy and Capone were locked in a sort of Mafia Cold War. Touhy, now feeling the pressure from the outfit, knew that Capone's next move would be to get the people of Touhy's western suburb territories on his side instead. That would actually be a challenge for the outfit, however, because Touhy had gained influence by promising not to include that type of ruckus behavior, including prostitution, in the western territories. Capone would make this move anyway. Unfortunately for the outfit, Touhy was one step ahead of them. The leaders in the western suburbs knew that they had no chance against resisting direct pressure from the outfit, but Touhy had preemptively reached out to the area's leadership and explained to them that if they stayed firm and dedicated themselves to keeping Capone out of the area, that Touhy and his crew would provide them protection. Local leadership agreed, and when Capone came knocking, they refused to answer. I do think it's worth noting that this particular story comes from Touhy's own memoir, and in fact, I'll admit a lot of the flavor text in this episode is going to come from Touhy's memoir, which is why he's so hard to report on. He has his own version of the story, but it's so colorful and fascinating that I would be remiss to ignore some of the things that he includes, but just understand that it's probably a little bit skewed in his direction. Now we start seeing the competition between Capone and Touhy heat up. Capone would once more send a group of men to speak with Touhy about taking over that territory. This time, one of Capone's men who had been one of the first negotiators with Touhy, that being Frank Rio, did not buy Touhy's important mob boss act a second time. And it would seem that, like any good performer, Touhy knew when he'd lost his audience. Sensing danger, Touhy gave Capone's men a false opening when he told them that he would be hosting a party at one of his roadhouses in Schiller Park, known as the Arch, that night. He was doing no such thing. In fact, what he was doing was testing the hunch that Capone's men would attack him. Touhy sent Rio and his men back to Capone with an invitation specifically extended to him and his underboss at the time, Frank Needy. After Rio and the other men left, Touhy got to work clearing out the Arch of its illegal booze and closed the whole place down. When Rio got back to Capone with the invitation, Capone tipped off the men on his payroll at the police station and orchestrated a raid on the Arch. Of course, when Capone's crooked policemen arrived, they found nothing. A close call and quick thinking by Touhy. It should be noted as well that Touhy is frequently linked, although the connection is rather convoluted, with antagonizing Capone in terms that extended past bootlegging. He was also involved in the push to remove the outfit influence from the unions. Think of the labor unions being taken over by the outfit as a twisted form of the Reformation, and Touhy's assistance in getting them out of the unions as a twisted form of the Counter-Reformation. This started around 1929-1930 and would intensify by the end of Prohibition. Capone's frustration with Touhy could likely be felt all across Chicago and the surrounding suburbs, particularly in the western suburbs. After that aggravating failure to take Touhy down at the Arch, Capone was ready to wipe this guy off the board. Under false pretenses, Capone sent another outfit A-lister and star in his own Rocket Review spotlight, Murray the Camel Humphreys, to bring Touhy a false olive branch. Humphreys would go to Touhy with an invitation to meet with underboss Frank Needy in Cicero, Illinois. Most reports claim that this meeting would have been held at the Hawthorne Inn. The purpose of this meeting? To establish a truce, a peace deal between Touhy and Capone. This plan by Capone would also fail, as it would seem that he had a leak within his ranks. Touhy had been warned ahead of time that this was not a peace offering, but rather an attempt to get Touhy to come to Capone's headquarters to be murdered. So, when Touhy essentially told Humphreys, "No way, let's meet at Schiller Park instead," Humphreys, frustrated, threatened Touhy outright. Touhy would respond by pulling a gun on Humphreys, which sent him back to Capone and Needy with his tail between his legs, and news that Touhy would not be attending any such meeting. Now, knowing what we know about Murray Humphreys, I think that this all sounds a little bit out of character for him. Now, perhaps he acted in a way that was out of character or on Capone's orders, I'm not sure. That we've all done that before, we've all done things that are outside of our character. I'm not saying that that's impossible, but what I am saying is that, again, with Touhy himself providing the flavor text, I just don't quite sense that this one is 100% honest. At this point, Capone and Touhy men were openly fighting one another, and Capone and Touhy themselves continued trying to one-up each other. The scales began to tip in Touhy's favor when Anton Cermak was elected mayor of Chicago, beating out the incumbent and Capone loyalist William Hale Thompson in 1931, who was, by the way, the last Republican ever elected mayor of Chicago as of the recording of this video. Cermak, although still corrupt, preferred to have the less rowdy crime leaders like Touhy as heads of the underworld. It's even reported that Cermak made deals with Touhy that he could be Chicago's kingpin if he and his men could get rid of that Capone outfit. As you can imagine, Capone did not take kindly to this and responded by kidnapping Touhy's partner, Matt Kolb. Remember him? Yes, through all of this, he had remained Touhy's partner. After forcing Kolb to pay the outfit $25,000 not to kill him, they kidnapped him, then made Touhy pay $50,000 to have him released. So double-dipping, basically. Capone would order his men to intimidate the Kolb half of the Touhy-Kolb faction by tearing up his businesses, destroying his property, pouring out his liquor, etc., before finally just ordering the man killed. Capone gave the order to take Kolb out, and the order was fulfilled on October 18, 1931, when he was shot dead in his club, Club Morton, in Morton Grove, Illinois. Touhy upped his security. This war wasn't a cold one, or even a lukewarm one anymore. Kidnapping was actually a very popular business during this time, and would ultimately lead to Touhy's downfall, although he never interacted with the crime itself. Allow me to explain. The Chicago outfit had had enough of Touhy, and were burning the candle on both ends to try to take this guy down. Negotiations hadn't worked, political pressure hadn't worked, intimidations hadn't worked, attempts to trick him hadn't worked, heck, even the kidnapping and murdering of his partner hadn't worked. Drastic, dramatic, and convoluted steps would now need to be taken in order to bring down Touhy, and the plan was eventually hatched by Murray Humphreys. Some argue that Needy was actually the mastermind of this plan, but from my research I think that Humphreys is the right call here. The outfit would hire the kidnapping kingpins Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker to abduct and hold for ransom William Ham Jr., the president of Ham's Brewing Company. Now, time for that long-awaited ham radio joke. This would mark the second time that Touhy's life would be defined by his involvement with Ham. Karpis Barker got their payday when the Ham family paid $100,000 to get Ham released. The law enforcement wing associated with Karpis and Barker protected them from investigation and the Chicago outfit, which had convinced the Karpis-Barker crew to undertake the kidnapping in the first place, would get to work whispering into the ear of the FBI special agent in charge of the investigation, Melvin Purvis, that this was all Touhy's doing. On June 30th, 1933, John Factor was also kidnapped. Except not really. Factor had a career as a gangster with the Chicago outfit, and his entire kidnapping had been a farce to avoid extradition. Factor was a major player in stock fraud and mail fraud, especially in England. This kidnapping killed two birds with one stone. It delayed his extradition, and he could blame Touhy for the fake kidnapping. Touhy was arrested for a weapons possession charge on July 19, 1933 in Wisconsin. Agent Purvis, ever dedicated to taking Touhy down, would drive to Wisconsin and drag Touhy back to Minnesota to face justice. And it's here where law enforcement goes off the rails. The FBI tried to bluff their way into a conviction of Touhy. They knew he was a notorious criminal, and if they could get him for something, they could get him for everything. Unable to get witnesses to identify Touhy in the Ham kidnapping or the Factor kidnapping, Purvis was forced to allow Touhy to go back to Wisconsin to face his weapons charge. Then Purvis insisted that he did in fact have witnesses linking Touhy to the Factor kidnapping, but would not reveal his sources. Because they were fake, of course. Since Purvis refused to reveal this information, he added on a conspiracy to kidnap charge just to gum up the system. For context, I think this is important because Touhy's arrest and indictment history is incredibly convoluted. When a charge is placed on someone, the prosecution is essentially saying, "I'm sure we can convict you of this." If you think of someone like Al Capone, it seems strange that he was only ever convicted of tax evasion, but the powers that be knew for sure that they could nab him for that, and trusted the cultural zeitgeist would punish Capone for the rest of his crimes, i.e. give him an enormous sentence that did not match the crime for which he was convicted. In Touhy's case, we have the opposite. Purvis was throwing spaghetti at the wall just to see what would stick. It's a much sleazier and truly less effective method of pursuing justice. I do think it's fair to say that Purvis was not really looking for justice, but a conviction. Purvis knew that this was going to be nearly impossible, since it was based on a lie, so it's reported that law enforcement beat and tortured Touhy in order to force a confession to make up for the lack of evidence. In Touhy's own words, "I went into jail in excellent physical shape. When I came out, I was 25 pounds lighter, 3 vertebrae in my upper spine were fractured, and 7 of my teeth had been knocked out. They questioned me day and night, abused me, beat me up, and demanded that I confess the Ham kidnapping. Never was I allowed to rest for more than half an hour. If I was asleep when a team of interrogators arrived to my cell, they would slug me around and bang me against the wall." The FBI would spend most of this time adding charges and adding to Touhy's legend, which really wasn't true. For instance, perhaps you've heard of Touhy's nickname synonymous with America's Menace. This was never his nickname. In fact, the FBI fabricated the story that other mobsters referred to him this way in order to bolster their case, and the fake kidnapping charges that were coming from at this point all over the country and being piled onto his name. Despite the evident corruption, a grand jury did convict Touhy and his associates for kidnapping, interstate transportation, and conspiracy on August 12, 1933. Touhy and his associates were the first to be prosecuted under the Federal Kidnapping Act, which allowed federal authorities to pursue kidnappers once they crossed state lines. An act that in my opinion makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately now has this dark shadow forever over it, as this was the first conviction of it. With the new use of fingerprint evidence by the FBI, it was found that the Barker-Karpus gang was likely responsible for the kidnappings, but there was so much piled up against Touhy at this point that he would be convicted for mail robbery and bank robbery before his November 1933 kidnapping trials. He first stood trial for the Ham kidnapping. Ham himself took the witness stand and identified one of Touhy's associates as his kidnapper. Another witness would insist that he saw Touhy loitering nearby, a weak connection, but this witness held firm to his testimony even under intense questioning. Law enforcement insisted that they had found kidnapping gear and weapons in Touhy's car, and Jake Factor, who never took the witness stand during the Ham trial, spent most of his time floating stories out to the press about his own kidnapping in order to sway public opinion regarding the Ham trial. Despite all of this and much more working against Touhy, the jurors would acquit him due to lack of evidence on November 28, 1933. While I'm sure Touhy was relieved, he still had the upcoming Factor trial to look forward to. Touhy was arrested immediately after his acquittal for the Factor kidnapping. The Factor prosecution had already begun building their case against Touhy. This trial began on January 16, 1934, and it would last until it was declared a mistrial on February 2, 1934, when Factor was confronted about the fact that back in July of the previous year, he had failed to identify Touhy in a police lineup. Factor claimed that he had been advised not to by law enforcement identify Touhy. Touhy was able to provide an alibi, and the jury was deadlocked, and the mistrial was declared. The second trial began on February 13, 1934, and this was even messier. One of Touhy's associates, in exchange for having charges against him dropped, turned state's evidence and corroborated Factor's story, while another one of Touhy's associates sided with the defense. Both men were connected with Touhy during these kidnapping fiascos. Despite a shoddy case by the prosecution, including a law enforcement officer claiming to have seen Factor shortly after he was allegedly released from being kidnapped and testified that he looked well, was well-dressed, and clean-shaven, despite Factor having testified that he was tortured and mistreated, Touhy was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with the opportunity of parole after 33 years. Nearly all of the money that Touhy had accumulated during his life was spent on legal fees and attempted appeals. It didn't help Touhy's case that he and other prisoners would escape prison on October 9, 1942. He was recaptured and surrendered after a month. An additional 199 years was added onto his sentence that New Year's Eve. In 1944, 20th Century Fox would release a movie about him, Roger Touhy, Gangster. Touhy would successfully sue the film company for defamation for $15,000, but this really didn't hurt the film too much since they were still able to release it in foreign markets. Plus, $15,000 didn't even touch the level of money needed to fix Touhy's problems. But hey, a win is a win. On August 9, 1954, Touhy would make some progress after a Touhy appeal finally had some legs for once. It was found that the associate who had turned state's evidence in the Factor trial had perjured himself, and that the entire Factor kidnapping was a fabrication to keep Factor from being deported. Touhy would be placed back in jail for an additional 48 hours while the release was being finalized. Just as an insult to injury, in my opinion. Touhy still had some issues to work out regarding his attempted escape from prison as well as other, smaller sentences. Ultimately, the court systems would work out his sentences, and he would walk out of confinement a completely free man on November 24th, 1959. He would walk into freedom with a book deal. At nearly the exact same time as his release, his autobiography, The Stolen Years, was released. It would seem that after all of the legal hoops, prison escapes, false accusations, and the majority of his lifetime being spent behind bars or behind the counsel table, Touhy was finally able to taste freedom and would start all over again, making his money from book deals. That is, until he was gunned down. On December 16, 1959, Touhy and his bodyguard were gunned down outside of his home at 10:30 p.m. by either 2 or 3 shadowed figures. Touhy was shot above the knee on both legs and rushed to St. Anne's Hospital, where he suffered tremendous amounts of blood loss. When he was moved into an oxygen tent, it's reported that he told medical staff and law enforcement, "I've been expecting it. The bastards never forget." Touhy was taken into the operation room where he would die on the table after having been given his last rites. It is widely believed that this hit was carried out by the Chicago outfit, who had patiently waited to take Touhy down after all these years. Roger Touhy died on December 17, 1959. His wife Clara and his son Roger Jr. arranged for a small private burial at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing the life of successful bootlegger Roger Touhy, about whom much is known. In fact, putting this together was pretty challenging. As strange as it sounds, I prefer to cover mobsters who are less well known because it cuts out a lot of that hearsay that you have to work through that comes along with these well-known guys. Touhy doesn't seem to be a household name from what I can tell, but the fact that so much information is known about him made it all the more challenging to put it together, but I hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about Roger Touhy. Also, don't forget to utilize that comment section and social media to let me know about who or what you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao.